My guest today is Eva Ryder. Eva's a psychotherapist with 25 years of practice who specializes in Jungian dream work and depth psychology. She received her master's from JFK University. Eva incorporates not only dream work in her practice, but also astrology, alchemy, and body-soul integration. Eva is trained in Marion Woodman's Body Soul Leadership Program, hypnotherapy, and something called TRE. Eva, thanks for being here and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I was really looking forward to this because I was introduced to your work through social media and I was immediately attracted to the archetypes and the artwork and, of course, all the writings that you do on the subject of therapeutic dream work on social media. And being a fan of Carl Jung, the Tarot, Kabbalah, etc., I found your work to be a pretty unique approach to therapy and one that would appeal to me. So let's get started for the benefit of those who absolutely know nothing about Jungian analysis and this particular brand of psychotherapy. Why don't we start here? What makes Jungian psychotherapy different from other forms of therapy?
Yes, thank you for that question, Mark. So, well, there are, of course, now a myriad of different ways to approach psychotherapy, and there are many modalities. What's interesting about Jungian therapy is it's not actually a theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a lens through which we look at the world. And that lens is, its purpose, so to speak, would be looking at the search for meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and its ultimate goal is wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
which is not something that fits well into the models that insurance companies are using, because that's very broad, wholeness. So the process to come to wholeness is the process of what Jung called individuation,
Right.
becoming the person who you were meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest gift, for instance, that he speaks of, and I'm paraphrasing, is becoming who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something, of course, that is a lifelong process. It's not something that we come to in early life. Like Freud definitely focused more on the developmental, the first half of life.
Right.
The second half of life, we're looking at issues much more of meaning
Mm-hmm.
and soul work. So it incorporates soul work in the second half of life. That becomes, and Jung's patients, he speaks of this, were mostly people who had come to a place in their life where they had achieved certain successes, but had lost the meaning.
Right.
And were depressed on because of that. And so, yeah. The other thing is that, as James Hillman said, Jungian work incorporates that archetypal eye.
Mm-hmm.
So you're bringing in something from a universal lens, in addition to just the actual day-to-day mundane level of existence.
Well, let's
And then,
stop for a second and talk about what archetypes are. A lot of people
yes,
think that archetypes and symbols are pretty much the same thing, synonymous. Do you see them as different?
they are different. And basically an archetype, well, the archetype comes from, I made some notes here, from the Greek word archein, to begin, or in the fields of philosophy and psychology.
Right.
The ancient Greek philosopher Plato believed that all things have ideal forms, and AKA archetypes, and of which real things are merely shadows or copies. But in C.G. Jung's astrology, archetypes refers to an inherited area or mode of thought that's present in the unconscious. So we could say that an archetype is a universal pattern of energy, and a symbol would be the mediator between that universal pattern of energy and how it manifests in our lives. For instance, for example, if you take the archetypal energy, the Great Mother, this is going to then manifest in different cultures in completely different ways,
Right.
right? Whether you have Kali or Isis or Mary or the Black Madonna or so on and so forth,
Right.
Pele. they're all aspects of the Great Mother energy, which is universal and runs through all, but it actually manifests very different. And the symbol for which, so the symbol itself is really important. So thanks for that question, Mark, because the symbol is the mediator. Mm-hmm. It's the bridge. Mm-hmm. It's the thing that connects that universal energy pattern to something that's manifested in our psyche. And one of the things that I always like to talk about is that it's also numinous, having to do with the beckoning of the God coming through. So it's not just an idea. Mm-hmm. Archetypes aren't an idea. It's a full body experience. It's falling in love. It's numinous. You experience it on so many levels. The God has come through.
Right. The two were once described to me as being different in that archetypes are a living energy that is ubiquitous and experienced multiculturally, and symbols are somehow subject to change, depending on the psyche of the humanity that is expressing or searching for a connection to that archetype. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
That's excellent. Yes.
For instance, the flag of the United States of America symbolizes the original 13 colonies and the 50 states. But if we have, a 51st state come into the Union, then the symbol changes, right? And yes. So there's nothing really permanent about symbology. It speaks to the current age. And as we shift through from one age into the next age, into the next stage, as humanity grows and evolves, those archetypes are still present and moving within the flow of the civilization that they're trying to inform. That speaks to that
precisely. And one of the arguments that comes up occasionally is, do archetypes change? And this is recently a more common one. Mm-hmm. And I think that Jung would have said, no, archetypes do not change. They're universal energy patterns.
Right.
So they're not manifest. The symbol, of course, changes, as you're saying. It'll change culturally. It'll change depending on the time period, the historical time period, the historical context in which we live.
Right.
They will change.
Right.
But the archetype doesn't change.
Right. Well, let's dive a little bit into how you're using dream work. Tell the audience what dream work is and what value does it bring to the psychotherapeutic process.
Yes. Well, dream work is an incredible gateway. I think of it, I was trained in dream work through Marion Woodman's work and my other analysts that I've worked with, all of whom were trained originally by in Zurich, and the focus is on Marie-Louise von Franz's work.
Right.
So it's more that than the archetypal work of Philman. So I would lean towards including, and we can get into these, active imagination, certainly an amplification, which involves, looking at the universal energy. Mm-hmm. For instance, an amplification would be looking up the word snake or serpent, right. And you're going to find 20 pages on it but that's a universal, again, archetype. Mm-hmm. And so working with symbols that way by amplifying, and then, doing active imagination where you actually get into engaging these different images that arise, which bring even more information. And this is done through a dialectic, best done through a written form, right. Because it fixes it.
Yeah.
Like, and for years I didn't understand this, that, why can't I grasp this? I've got this imagination and these different figures are floating in my consciousness. But if you don't fix it by writing it down, fix it as in salt.
Right. Sure.
Then you're going to potentially lose it. You'll float away. Right. They'll float away.
Well, let's talk about what it is that the it is here. What are these images? What's your interest in these images? And where do you think these images are coming from?
Well, we don't know exactly where they come from, but they, Marion Woodman used to say, well, these are your own images. So they're really pure. They're not coming from somewhere else, but that's nobody's put them there, was what she said.
Right.
But they are actually coming from somewhere else, because in some cases, there are different kinds of dreams, of course.
Right.
Most dreams are compensation dreams. So they're giving us information about how to balance, what is out of balance in your life. And the dream will come and show you where something is out of balance. But that's not the only kind of dream. There's also proprioceptive dreams, which point forward to the future. Those are more rare. And then there's the big dream, which are lifetime dreams.
Right.
The ones you wake up and you never forget. You don't even have to write them down. And those are the ones that will work on you sometimes for decades of your life.
Would it be fair in your assessment to consider some dreams as being part of your personal subconscious memory story integration process, and some dreams, the proprioceptive or precognitive dreams, if you like to call them that, are dealing with making a connection to those archetypes that we were speaking about earlier, part of a super conscious construct?
Yes, absolutely. And they are a bridge. I mean, I often think of the dream messenger, Hermes, Mercurius being the dream messenger.
Right.
Because Mercurius is the god that moves between the worlds. He was the god that was able to move between the worlds. So I often think of the dream messenger as Mercurius. And when we don't write our dreams, or we're not paying attention to them, he leaves. She leaves. He said, okay, you're not listening, I'm gone. And then takes a while to invite him back.
Right.
And yet there are other times where if you are in contact with that dream messenger, then you will get more and more information. So he's a mediator figure, and the dream messenger is bringing us information, as you said, both from the universal, the consciousness that is an archetypal consciousness, which is in the personal consciousness, and the transpersonal as well.
Right. So for the sake of those who are listening that may be very familiar with the science of psychotherapy, a lot of psychologists I'm sure are out there listening, there's a schism of sorts between what I'll call the mechanistic or mechanical viewpoint of, say, clinical psychotherapy and the Jungian approach, which seems to have a more holistic construct in terms of the notion of psyche or soul. Would you say that that's a pretty fair assessment of the balance between the two camps of psychotherapy?
Yes, and yes. And we're not there yet. I mean, Jung himself believed that it would take hundreds, I think he said something like 500 years before his work came fully into use and was recognized. And he continues even to this day, although it's changing, I believe, to be fringe. And what's happened, and of course, Ian McGilchrist's work examines this, the matter with things, which his paradigm-changing work around left brain, right brain orientations, and that our culture has moved very much towards that left brain. And the mechanistic view, of course, is an example of that. And when I first started psychology, I was at McGill in early 1970s, and all psychology was experimental. So we were working with Pavlov and Skinner, and we were looking at the human mind as a machine.
Engaging behavioral patterns.
Exactly. Right. Behavioral patterns, memory, cognition, behavioral patterns, exactly, all of that. And I dropped out after a year. I was just overwhelmed by I dropped out right before Rat Lab class.
Rat
Lab, and I thought that's it. And I switched into history for that period.
Don't like rats, huh?
In shock. No, experiments on rats, and so basically, yes. Back to your question. There is a huge difference. So this mechanistic view is the one that psychology has held now for way back since the 40s, 50s, or at least.
Right.
And that shift is happening now because we're having to do a lot of trauma work. And the trauma work, although,
Yes.
is changing the way we're looking at it. Now, we're still not, I mean, dream work, hypnotherapy, a lot of these things are still not accepted. A lot of the mechanistic view is very, it fits the model for the insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
The insurance companies, because they can say, okay, let's deal with this person's anxiety. You have 6 sessions and you can deal with this anxiety and you're done. Well, Jungian psychology doesn't fit that at all because its goal is wholeness.
Right.
Which
I find that such an interesting dichotomy because I mean, I understand the need and desire to put things into a pathological box and create a diagnostic and statistical manual, DSM.
Right.
I'm assuming that insurance companies probably pay different amounts of money based on the diagnosis coming out of a DSM. I don't really know for certain, but I saw you nod, so there must be truth in that. The reason I see it as a dichotomy is because the word psyche, prefix of the word psychology, is the study of a soul. It literally means soul. Where does the soul fit into the DSM? Do you know?
It's not there. It's just gone. It's nowhere to be seen. And that's what we've lost. I mean, that's exactly right, Mark. I mean, the soul is not part of this mechanistic view of psychology. And again, just mentioning Ian McGilchrist talking about how we've moved into this mechanistic view, which is very left brain. Mm-hmm. Not that we don't lead left brain, but it's much more predatory. He speaks about how it makes the map, mm-hmm. but it doesn't include the intuition, the imagination, the soul. Right. And I see soul very much as a mediator between spirit and matter, between the divine and between the body and nature even. So that's missing. And the other thing that I think is really important to mention is that the goal, is to teach people how to adapt to society, mm-hmm. in a mechanistic view. Right. Whereas in a Jungian view, you are trying to become yourself.
Right.
So you're not adapting to society. You're having to step outside of those societal boundaries, mm-hmm. and discover who you really are. Right. And that's something that, and Joseph Campbell, of course, spoke about that.
Quite a lot, yeah.
Quite a lot, that traditional mechanistic view of psychology moved us towards how can I be a cog in this wheel? Mm-hmm. Well, right now our wheel is going through a major change. It's a shift. We're shifting out of that. That's to adapt to a system that is breaking down and going through a transformation is just not working for people anymore.
No, and I think that's creating a lot of psychic stress that I think we should be addressing as we go along through here. It makes your work incredibly valuable. So you mentioned 2 ideas that I'm very fond of, one being individuation, or as Maslow described it, self-actualization, and self-realization, which has a more mystical connotation because it speaks to the idea of that numinous connection to the gods, that search for the divine within, which is incorporated in the Jungian construct, ironically, or maybe not so much ironically as mysteriously. Maslow, at the end of his work in the study of the self-actualization pyramid and talking about how we go through this individuation process through achieving various needs, and we reach this apex. I'm making a triangle for you folks at home. At the top of this pyramid lies this concept or idea of being whole, self-actualized, the within coming without. Weirdly, strangely, mysteriously, Maslow found at the end of his career that there were correlating principles between what he perceived as self-actualized people. And those principles were a flow an acknowledgement of the oneness of things, the interconnectedness of things. In that respect, that's not really a psychological principle as it is a spiritual principle. I mean, I've
Yes.
always found that weird and amazing. So I sit in amazement that psychology hasn't grasped that. That the whole idea there is just to find something to make somebody functional within the society and the environment that they're dealing with, which I think has value. But I
Yes.
wonder if the approach isn't somehow skewed by leaving out the soul. What are your thoughts on that? I think I know what your thoughts are, but I'd like for the audience to hear it.
Thank you, Mark. Well, absolutely. I mean, the soul, I see the soul as a mediator also, the soul mediating between spirit and matter, as I've mentioned.
Right,
And psyche means soul.
right.
We know that. So that's been lost in our language and the way we've approached it as we moved into this mechanistic way of working. We've lost the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And in the really deep psychology, when people coming in search of meaning, this work is soul work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a long-term work. It's a depth work. I mean, what does it mean on a soul level?
Right.
And since that word is not, it's just not part of our vocabulary. In terms of, you can't talk to an insurance company and say we're working on this person's soul. That's not going to mean anything to them.
Sure. Right.
But nevertheless, it becomes really important. This idea of Maslow's self-actualization, where you're actually bringing through the spirit, through the person's psyche.
Right.
You know, what does that mean? You're creating a bridge. What else can be said about that?
Well, I'm thinking about Jung's idea of the anima mundi, the soul of the world, right?
Soul of the world.
The world upon which we all are walking on is our perception. And if you think about it a little bit more in a 3D type of way, it's not just, on a horizontal axis, right? It's also on a vertical axis. We are inside of the world. There's an ozone layer protecting us from the void of space. We literally live in a sphere. So I'm thinking about that archetype or idea of the anima mundi, and I'm thinking about the collective consciousness of humanity, which he spoke a lot about in his collective unconscious theory, which connects to the archetypes, and how this wisdom seems to move from age to age to age and is still contained, even though the symbols change a little bit. The wisdom itself is contained within a sphere of sorts, just like the earth, container. The connective tissue there may well be this thing that Jung talked about regarding synchronicity, that interconnectedness of things. Do you want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit and talk about?
Yes, we can. Absolutely. It's interesting, and I appreciate that you brought up that symbol of the triangle, because that's a symbol that I think is important to both of us in how to view all of this. So with the symbol, just to delve into that a little more, we have these two angles of the triangle, which also could be said to represent the two sides, the polarities,
Right.
the paradox. And it's not a negative or positive thing, but there is this, what Jung called tension of opposites, that makes it necessary for transformation happens at the apex of the triangle, at the third.
Right.
So one way to speak of that is if we hold the tension, if we don't move to one side or to the other, in which case we're going to lose that tension. But if we can hold that long enough, then the third will open, the apex will open, and we can find ourselves catapulted into, brought into a third vision of reality that was not even imagined. And I think Einstein spoke about this as well. So that is one thing I wanted to speak to about the triangle. Now back to synchronicity. So what is synchronicity? It's the experience of the acausal. In other words, it's meaningful coincidence.
Right.
And it's so interesting because it's often one thing you have a dream experience, for instance. That's one way you dream of something, and then it becomes replicated. It becomes manifest in the outer world. So it's a place where the outer world and the inner world meet and conjoin.
Right.
And it's so stunning when that happens, because suddenly there's meaning. I mean, where does that come from? In a meaningless universe, that wouldn't make any sense, and we've called it coincidence. But is it coincidence when it is so specific? But the meaningful coincidence, of course, Jung's famous example of that was the woman with the scarab,
right,
where he was talking with her, and
the scarab
I think she was the scarab dream, and he picked it off the window. But of course, we all have experiences like that all the time if we are attuned to that happening.
That's
and
right.
That acausal bridging it creates a bridge between this world, our mundane everyday world, and this other world which is trying to communicate with us. And what does that mean when you have a synchronous experience? Of course, all of this was Wolfgang Pauli's work, and with Jung came out of this. There's an extraordinary story how I think Pauli was much more attuned to this even than Jung. But what always struck me is at the end of Pauli's life, and he died quite young. He died at 58. And he was always obsessed with this number of 137. I mean, it always followed him. And when he went into the hospital at the end of his life, the room number was 137.
Wow.
And he walked in there and he said, I'm not coming out of this room.
Right. You brought up two ideas that I really want to kind of flesh out for the audience, because a lot of the folks that I have on this show are psi researchers and quantum theorists. And these folks are implying that consciousness is somehow affecting reality in a way that we don't quite yet understand the full mechanics of, but we suspect, we see it occurring. You also spoke of the tension of opposites at the base of the triangle, manifesting a third thing at the apex. Those two ideas speak loudly to me in terms of functions of consciousness. And that's really why I wanted to get you in here to have this conversation. That tension of opposites, the acknowledgement of that tension of opposites, is something that the personal psyche, my own personal experience, can get absorbed in. We can lean extreme right, we can lean extreme left. We think positively, we think negatively, whatever your style is, your personality style, and how you cope with the world. But being able to hold those two opposites in a way that is neutral and curious seems to me to be the thing that propels us to the apex of the triangle.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is how it happens. But boy, it is not easy to hold that tension, because inevitably we're going to take a stance on one side or the other. And we're certainly seeing this politically on so many levels, actually, not just politically in our world. It's like we're taking these extreme polar views, and we immediately become out of balance when we do that. So to hold that tension of opposite takes huge strength, and it takes what Marion Woodman used to refer to as surrender. It's a surrender of the ego, of thinking we know what we know. And that's not an easy thing to do, because you're having to stand in the place of I don't know. And I often think, we're living in a world of I don't know right now. And that's very uncomfortable for human beings, because we like to have a system of security that we can count on. And that system of security is trembling right now. It's shaking. And so ultimately our only choice is to be able to stand in the I don't know, hold that tension of maybe this, maybe that, and just wait until that third comes through.
Yes. And we're about to get into some pretty deep waters. Before we do, I want to give our sponsor a minute of airtime, and we'll be back with Eva Ryder in just a moment.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
So as you were saying, we're being called to hold the tension of opposites and also the unknown, which, as you said, is very hard to do. Because the outward manifestation of this psychic tension, if I can use that phrase to describe it, internally seems to be manifesting itself in our external world, in the same way that the psi researchers that I speak of are talking about how a function of consciousness produces a physical, observable effect in the outer world, in the same way that Jung spoke about it in terms of synchronicity. So the idea of it just being synchronicity, just being a meaningful coincidence, in my view, kind of diminishes the idea a little bit in the eyes of those with a more mechanistic viewpoint of psychology, in the same way they diminish the idea of psi or psyche as being a soul function. If synchronicity is in fact a physical manifestation of the tension that we're all holding inside as expressed in the outer world and observable by many, who then take that information in and have a reaction of that psychic tension, the wheels of the universe, if I can use the mechanics of the universe, seem to be responding to what's going on, and it's a biofeedback loop of sorts.
Yes, exactly. It's acausal.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the universe is beckoning. I mean, that's the definition of the numinous in a way. The universe is beckoning in a synchronicity, and we're responding. So there's, if you imagine the figure eight kind of interplay, there's a dialectic going on between these two realms that are reminding we are not all there is. There is another energy, another consciousness that is attempting to make a contact and communicate with us. And that interplay between that level of that other realm and us, it manifests as a synchronicity. And it's always there if we're paying attention to it. It's just that we're not always aware of it.
Well, I certainly paid attention. I saw your posts on Facebook. I said, this lady is somebody I want to talk to on this podcast. And
I was walking. I went out for a walk yesterday, and it was kind of a dark week on so many levels. And as I was walking around, and plus we had this full moon, there were so many crows. And I thought, wow, alchemically, the crow has to do with the Negredo, with the dark night of the soul.
Yes.
And I thought, this is on some level like we're in that place right now. And it felt like a synchronicity that there were so many crows. And I thought, okay, well, it's time to go back and take a look at the dark night, the Negredo, which it feels very much like we're in that place on a planetary level
And if
globally.
I'm not mistaken, the crow is also a psychopomp in several various traditions.
Yes. Yes.
Well, okay, now we can see clearly why a behavioralist would have an issue with all of this information. It's not very scientific, so to speak, unless we delve into the realm of quantum field theory and, I don't know, psi research in general, which a lot of scientists don't see as very scientific because it's very hard to reproduce these effects time and time again in clinical labs, under the same conditions. So empirically, it's difficult. But yet we know that this is happening and we can see it. And those with a mystical bent can easily see it. So it's my understanding that Jung was often accused by his peers as being more of a mystic than a scientist. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Yes, that seems to be accurate. That which is why he's still considered fringe in many circles, is that he was seen as a mystic. But that's such an interesting question because it became clear reading Jung, especially after the Black Books and Red Book came out, is that he struggled with it because on the one hand he was a Gnostic, and eventually moved more into the realm of where he would have called himself an alchemist, a hermeticist, and the hermeticists were alchemists, and so he looked at the psychological processes from an alchemical perspective, and yet at the same time he held to the idea that he was a scientist. He was an empiricist. Everything he came to, he observed, even the dream work, even that he did thousands and thousands of dreams with people, but he was always researching it in terms of these different, looking at it through the lenses of different cultures and traditions. And of course, that gave him more information of the archetypal because it'll manifest differently in different culture, but the universal themes remain. But yes, I think that Jung ultimately, this is my perspective on it, but towards the end of his life, he was a mystic. Because the last few books where in the collected works with alchemical studies, Mysterium Cutionis, which was his very last work, he was certainly an alchemist, and certainly with all the research he had done, what was coming through was this the mystic in Jung.
I would call his work psycho-spiritual work because it did not leave out the need for the search for the soul or the understanding of the soul or the realization of this thing that we call a self, perhaps existing on multidimensional levels. That's a bit of a stretch, but I just finished 2 very long conversations with quantum theorists, one of them being a mutual friend of ours, Federico Figin, talking about consciousness being pre-existing in a dimension outside of us. And Tom Campbell, who speaks about our very physical existence as being much like a video game avatar living in a simulation that is being informed and controlled by something outside of us. Echoing back to Joseph Campbell's observation on speaking about consciousness as being a sea in which we swim, one in which the psychotic drowns and the mystic swims with delight.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But it's not easy. And it creates that tension, can create neurotic response, to speak in psychologist's language. So we both know that Jung and you and I have a fascination and an interest with Tarot, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah, 3 of which we're both very passionate about. And I want to add, before I go down this rabbit hole, I want to talk a little bit more about the conjunctio. My Latin is awful. Conjunction.
Conjunction is fine, yes.
Between the various worlds, the upper world and the lower world, Or if we're to speak about it on a personal level, the subconscious, our search for the soul, the collective unconscious, and what we experience consciously in the world. What is alchemy, and why do you use it in your practice?
Great question, Mark. Well, it's something that has been, it's underlying, it, to me, it's embedded in the Kabbalistic tree itself. And the process of alchemy, from a Jungian perspective, is what we experience. And, it's quite complex. I've been studying it, I'm still studying it.
Right.
I'm not a quantum physicist, but I do want to say this, that having listened to Federico Fagin and the way he speaks of consciousness, I think that my sense is that ultimately quantum physics and Kabbalah are really saying the same thing. They're pointing, of course, we know in Kabbalah there are 4 trees that, resonate with 4 different levels of consciousness.
Right.
And it's probably the lower 2 that we experience on this plane. But getting back to the subject of the alchemy, we'll get to the Kuniuktio. There are 3 Kuniuktios. We can come back to that. But to begin with, the phases in alchemy, they begin with the prima materia, the dark matter that is supposedly unconscious, at least the way we see it. It's just mush.
Potential.
Right? It's potential. And that with the light, the spark that comes through of consciousness begins this transformation process. Now, what I found fascinating in my study, again, everything comes back to Mercurius.
Right.
Mercurius, as the god, is also called the quintessence. He's called the beginning and the end. So Mercurius exists in the prima materia, in that raw matter, but also exists on the other side as the philosopher's stone. So that image that we're familiar with of the Ouroboros, which is the snake eating its own tail, is a symbol for this process where it's constantly circulating.
Right.
And so in alchemy, this energy is constantly circulating. There's the earth matter, and then there's that image of it sprouting wings at the other side, and then turning again. Now, it's probably not a circle. It's probably a spiral. The Kabbalistic tree itself, I always think of as a spiral. If you look at it from the bottom up, it's a spiral. If you look at it from the top down, it's a spiral. And the center of the tree, which is in that place of beauty of Tiferet, holds the center. And that we could say is an analogous to the place of the Kuniuktio,
right?
Where everything comes together. But to get to the, to just move through the phases, in the dark night, in that place of the prima materia, we have, which is relegated to Saturn astrologically, we have the Great Mother. It's strangely enough is the place of Bina, the Great Mother of the dark matter. Why? Because she is the creator and destroyer of form,
the bringer of
but
form.
We don't
exactly. Right.
But nevertheless, that phase of Negredo, where everything melts away, then moves across to that is connected to fire, the element of fire, where it breaks it down, completely changes its form in alchemy. And then there is the phase of from fire to water then being the solucio or dissolution phase, where things just dissolve. And that can be experienced psychologically. We're going from a very deep depression. Hillman actually talks about a blue phase, which we're familiar with, where you feel blue.
Right.
And that's a phase in between. And then we move into the solucio phase, the solution where you're really in that melancholia, where you're really feeling the emotion, the sadness. And fortunately, that too moves to a place where we move from the water into the air phase, which is a separatio, or separation.
Right.
And I think that it's really important because the separation is where we can finally step back and observe what is happening. So it's I, thou.
Right.
This isn't just, I'm not just this mass. I can reflect. I can begin
Right.
to reflect
Right.
and self-reflect.
Right.
And once you have that separation, you're back in that tension of opposites, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from that place, you can come to the conjunctio. And the conjunctio conjunction of the masculine and feminine in balance is really the apex of that triangle. So that would, maybe a very rough outline of the first conjunction.
We gave a lot of correspondences in things between Kabbalah and alchemy and philosophy in general that speak to the psyche of an individual going through a process of transformation. That's going to require that we take apart a lot of what you just said and give the easily digestible nuggets to those who are not initiated in this understanding of how this works. But the idea of the conjunction and the idea of what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I had the pleasure of knowing and working with in my life, talked about in terms of the phases of grief in the process of grief, are very much in alignment with this because it's a recreation of a self when things break down and as we move through life. I knew who I was. I knew I had an ident. I was a wife. I was a mother. I was a husband. I was a father. I did this for a living. And all of a sudden, I'm moving into a new phase of life where you were discussing before that second phase of life that Jung had made the observations where self-actualization has to happen again. And it's a realization of a self that's on a very different level, mostly pertaining to the soul, probably rooted in the concept or fear that the self, quote unquote, will not exist once the body dies. So, that may be the motivation. But the idea of the movement through the process of turning base metals into gold is not a mystical thing, a performance that, say, Albus Dumbledore would do at Hogwarts. It's a psychological process of assimilation that has not only to do with that tension of opposites, but also that tension of opposites on a vertical level, that which is above, so below. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
So is that how you use alchemy in your work? Do you talk about those tensions of opposites and walk people through that?
There's so many places to go here, and the tension of opposites is of course, we're not necessarily holding that tension, as you pointed out.
Right,
I mean, oftentimes we're really on one rung, on one level, one side or the other, and we're trying to come back to that place where we're holding both,
where we can be the fulcrum.
Yeah, where we can be the fulcrum.
Right.
So, excuse me. So, what is the question again?
So the question is, how do you apply alchemy in the work that you're doing as you help people move through new phases of life or deal with the traumas that they're coming to consciousness with in life, and use those energies in a way that can make them produce a different form of life for themselves? That's the question I want to ask.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, most often I find this is where I'm relying on the tools of astrology and dream work a lot, and bringing in the alchemy through the astrology, because of course they align. If you're going through a Pluto transit, for instance, then you're certainly going to be going through or a Saturn transit for that time. That it's going to be a dark night. You're going to be, oftentimes there's a loss of meaning. And how then do we come back to a place where we can begin to incorporate meaning and purpose,
Right.
and vitality, because the vitality goes when you're in that nigredo place,
It
in the
does.
dark mush place.
Right.
And oftentimes all that vitality is now in the dream world. It's not in life. You're not living it. It's not in the external. And so the energy has retreated into the dream world. And so the dream world will become very, very active during these dark times. And so by going in and accessing the figures in the dream and bringing those to life through a dialectic, through active imagination, we begin to be able to find what there are, as Jeffrey Raff points out, there are guides. They've always been there, but we're not in touch with them because they're not in physical form, and it's not something that is accepted in our culture, that we do have these guides, and they come through as figures of light, I believe. They're not just figures of light, as Jung said, but they're real. Everything in the imagination, according to Jung, is real.
Right.
So that's a whole different way of perceiving life, because we thought the imagination, that's just made up. But as Jung points out, I mean, without the imagination, nothing would ever be created. We imagine it first.
There you have it.
Yeah.
And
So
where does
in
that come from, right? I mean, that's a whole different rabbit hole.
That's a whole different rabbit hole.
Right.
We're talking about where does imagination come from? But in this dark night, in this nigredo place, we work with the dreams. The other piece, of course, is bringing in the astrology, because what the astrology gives us, again, is this connection between the elements and the planets. And they have a relationship, of course, to each other, as we know Kabbalistically.
Even physically in the macrocosm of the universe. We don't live our relationship in the orbit of the sun isn't only dependent upon the sun and the distance of the earth from the sun. It's also allows life to be as it is in the earth because of the distance of the moon to the earth and to the sun, and which tilts us and keeps us in a perfect harmonic balance. I used harmonic with the meaning of harmony. If the moon was to go so far out of our orbit, it would tilt the axis of the earth and make life in the earth uninhabitable. So on the mundane level, the mundane sphere, as the Kabbalists like to call it, the physical sphere of the cosmos, astrology has a physical representation that is important to keep in balance.
Yes, absolutely. Beautifully said. And holds it. I mean, the moon, in Kabbalah, the moon, the lunar phase, which is called Yesod, actually holds the entire tree.
Yes.
And I consider that we are trees. I mean, if we back into the tree, we are actually inhabiting it. It becomes a chakra system as well on a physical level.
Sure.
But that lunar magnetism, that magnet of the moon is also, of course, reflective. It reflects the sun, and the sun, of course, reflects another light that is the sun behind the sun,
right?
Which would be the top of the tree is Keter. It's the ultimate apex,
right?
And which is the crown. So we can talk more about the crown as we go.
We will too.
Yes, and that the moon holds it. It's the place that it distills all of the energies. And I don't know if this is helpful, but I think that the realm on the tree of the moon, the lunar phase, is where that's the realm of dreams. That bottom triangle is the realm of dreams. You have imagination.
The parts of theme.
And Netzach, right? And Venus, which is connected to Venus.
Right. And
Venus, for whatever it's worth, is connected to copper, the element. And then opposite is Quicksilver, Mercury, and thinking. And so you have imagination and thought. and they meet in this triangle of the dream realm, the astral realm.
Right.
And so through that realm, we are a little closer to the earth, but we are also drawing down all the energy from the top, from the crown, from the Godhead, and the soul then is that which mediates. And, the self, what Jung called the self, would have been all of it.
Yes. Implying that we're not our thoughts, we're not our feelings, we're not our subconscious, we're not just meat puppets hurtling through space at 180 million miles an hour or whatever it actually is. We are also creating something. Before we get deeply into Kabbalah and the correspondences between psychology, astrology, and alchemy, it's important to help people understand what it is that we're talking about. In my opinion, we're talking about a psycho-spiritual process, as you pointed out. We're climbing up the tree of life through these four worlds, as the Kabbalists like to call them, in some respects. In other respects, we're trying to embody them in a new way, these ideas. So let's talk about Kabbalah from a tarot perspective, and the connections between the spheres on the tree of life, and the psychological principles that we're actually addressing here. Because it's not just an influx of energies coming down, it's also an influx of energies going on a horizontal plane, perhaps, creating synchronicity, right? And how we're creating our world, as Pauli understood, as other quantum field theorists who understand the observer effect and how it affects reality, physical reality, observable reality, objective reality, and meaningful coincidences, which can be more personal. It means something to me, but it may not mean something to you. It helps me ascend the tree of life. Let's start from Yesod, being that you brought it up. Yesod is a Hebrew word that means foundation. It sits the ninth sphere, or sphira in Hebrew, on the tree of life. It's one of its secret names is the machinery of the universe.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I didn't give it that name. I just found it a curious name. Does that speak to you of the underlying principles of how we are creating that which the quantum field theorists are observing, or psi researchers are observing? Because theoretically, the moon is also symbolic, and I'll underline and italicize that word, having to do with the subconscious. That's why people howl at the moon. We get, experience lunacy, to use those attributions, right? What are your thoughts about astrology, the relationship to Yesod, the moon, and personal unconscious in the ascent, the climbing of the tree of life? What are your thoughts around that?
That's a wonderful question. And yes, I mean, I think first of all, on a broader scale, of the climbing the tree is the evolution,
right?
And whereas coming down the tree is the involution. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, I understand it. Why don't we define what most people have a sense of what evolution is? Let's talk about involution. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Meaning just that we are going from this denser kind of reality. We're moving from earth towards spirit, but we're doing it in this diagonal way, which was called in Kabbalah, is called the serpent path. And that's what we're talking about. It up in involution, I think, would be the emanation is coming from the top down. So evolution would be coming from this dense matter that that is Malkuth, which is the earth itself.
Right.
And that is reflected in the moon, as you said, in Yesod, which is the machinery of the universe, which holds everything. But we're in the astral realm. And that level, the astral realm, that Yesod, the moon, holds the upper tree, but it also connects us to the earth.
Yes.
And and I know that doesn't entirely answer your question, but I think that going up the tree is evolution, because we're starting from a place of ground, and we have to, astrologically, or I should say in tarot, the first card, and I won't go into all of them, of course, because there are 22 major arcana cards, once upon a time called trumps, and they represent the pathways of that take us from one realm on the Sephira of consciousness, between one realm and the other. The first one that we arrive at is the anima mundi. It's the world soul. But to get from the ground, from Malkuth, from the earth, to the moon realm through this pattern, it's so interesting that it's related to Saturn. Again, Saturn, which is at the top of the tree as the great mother, but also manifests. And the first card we see is this card of Saturn. Now, Saturn happens to be on the psychological realm, the confrontation with the shadow. So it's the first path. It's the confrontation with the shadow. It's Saturn. Okay. So, and it's called the 32nd path. It's a very difficult pathway, because we are having to integrate. So the first place we arrive is, how do I confront who I really am? I have to confront that dark side of me that I don't want to own. I don't like that part of me. I want it to go away. And yet, in order to make the journey of evolution going up, we have to confront that part of ourselves. So that's the beginning of the work. Yes. That's the beginning of the work. And that's the beginning of, having that breakdown of the old matter, so that we begin to refine. And I think that the lunar aspect is so much about refining. Whether we're going up or down the tree, it's about refining and crystallizing, the form that we thought we had. So we're not just matter. Now, coming down the tree, just to make a huge leap, if we're coming down the tree, we're actually bringing spirit into matter. Yes. Going up the tree, we're bringing matter into spirit.
Right. So I'm going to leave this conversation at this point and call this part 1, because part 2 is going to get a little bit more intense and a little bit more oriented towards this thing called Kabbalah. You've probably heard of it. Both Eva and I are pretty well versed in it. So in our next episode, you're going to get a small lesson in Kabbalah, as Kabbalah applies to the psycho-spiritual nature of consciousness as it's coming in and emanating from you, the individual. Hope you enjoy it. We'll see you next week.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.